Every star chart in the known galaxy listed the same entry for Sol 3. Species human, status extinct. No one had questioned that entry in 60 years. No one had reason to. This is the story of what the galaxy missed. The Vaskar Combine held the largest archive of dead civilizations in known space. 600 entries, 600 species wiped from the stars by war, plague, or the slow grinding conquest of empires larger than themselves. Entry 412 read, Humanity, Homeworld Sol 3, destroyed in the Caldron Dominion Sol campaign 61 years ago. No survivors detected, no further activity recorded. Archivist Meth Salrin had cataloged that entry personally, 30 years into her career, using scorched orbital debris and a handful of Dominion battle reports as her only sources. She had never once doubted it. Her chamber aboard the archive vessel Deep Record was lined with data cores from every dead world she had ever confirmed. She had a system. She trusted her system. In 30 years, it had never once failed her. "Archivist," said a junior researcher, stepping into her chamber, "we're picking up something odd near the Sol system. A supply convoy reported an encrypted signal on an old human frequency." Salrin did not look up from her console. Human frequencies have been dead for 60 years. It's noise. Cosmic background interference mimicking an old broadcast pattern. It happens more than people think. "It happened 3 times this month, ma'am." Salrin paused. She had cataloged 600 extinctions in her career. She had learned across all of them that dead civilizations did not send signals, not even accidentally, not even once every few decades. "Show me the data," she said. The junior researcher pulled up the readings. 3 short bursts, spaced weeks apart, each one bearing the specific harmonic signature the Combine's own linguistic database associated with pre-invasion human communication protocols. "It could be an old automated relay," Salrin said slowly, more to convince herself than the researcher. "A satellite that survived the bombardment, still cycling through a dead broadcast loop after 61 years. 61 years is a long time for a satellite to keep working without maintenance, ma'am." Salrin said nothing to that. 400 light-years away, beneath the frozen crust of a moon no star chart had ever properly surveyed, 11 billion humans continued a project that had taken 61 years, 3 generations, and every ounce of patience a species could muster. They were not extinct. They had simply stopped being loud. 61 years earlier, the Caldron Dominion had come to Sol 3 exactly as they had come to 400 worlds before it. They had not expected resistance. They had not received much. Earth's scattered, fractured defense forces, divided by nations that had never fully unified, weakened by decades of underinvestment in orbital defense, working from different command structures that couldn't even agree on shared communication protocols, had fallen within 11 days. The Dominion, satisfied with a swift conquest and eager to move its fleet toward richer targets, had done something it rarely bothered to do with smaller worlds. It left. It stationed no permanent garrison. It assigned no occupying government. It simply logged Earth as pacified, stripped its most valuable orbital infrastructure, salvaged what technology it judged worth the effort, and filed a report describing catastrophic civilian casualties consistent with the effective end of organized human civilization. The report was wrong. It was wrong because the humans who survived that invasion had learned, in 11 brutal days, exactly what a single lesson costs when it arrives too late to save a first war. And they had decided, unanimously, in the ruins of everything they'd known, that it would never arrive too late again. They let the galaxy believe the lesson had killed them. Then they went to work proving it hadn't. Fleet Commodore Yaris Dunn of the Vaskar Combine had never been ordered to investigate a dead world before. He found the assignment faintly beneath him. An archivist wants to chase ghost signals near a corpse system, he told his executive officer, a broad-shouldered Vaskar named Seton, as their cruiser Ashen Verdict prepared to break orbit from the Combine's forward staging post. This is a waste of a warship and a waste of my time. Orders are orders, Commodore, Seton said. Archivist Salrin has Combine authorization, direct from the High Council. They want the anomaly cleared before the Dominion notices it themselves and decides Sol 3 is worth a second look. Yaris snorted. The Dominion abandoned that rock 61 years ago. Nothing down there but ash and bones and the occasional malfunctioning relay. We'll find a broken beacon, log it, and be back at the staging post within the week. He was not entirely wrong that something was down there. Age. E was catastrophically wrong about what? The Ashen Verdict was a modest cruiser by Combine standards. 300 meters, moderate shielding, a crew of 400, entirely unremarkable in a galaxy full of far larger warships. It was, by every reasonable calculation available to Yaris Dunn, more than sufficient to investigate a dead world stray radio noise. Set a course, he said, minimal escort. This doesn't require a war fleet, just a working sensor array and a little patience. Seton hesitated before relaying the order. Commodore, for what it's worth, Archivist Salrin has never once been wrong about an extinction entry. 30 years, 600 worlds catalogued. Her record is spotless. Then she'll be right about this one too, Yaris said. Dead is dead. He did not know that beneath the ice of a moon 3 light towers from Earth, an engineering division 4 generations deep into an uninterrupted 61-year project, had already detected his cruisers approach the moment it crossed the outer debris field. The very same debris field the Vaskar Combine's own sensors registered as nothing but dead wreckage from a war 2 generations gone. They're coming to check the signal leak, said Chief Engineer Rosa Idrissi, watching the contact appear on a screen buried 4 kilometers beneath ancient ice, in a control room that had operated in continuous silent shifts since before her own parents were born. One cruiser, modest escort, nothing our perimeter can't handle if it comes to that. Her second-in-command, a young officer barely 30 years old, born decades after the invasion his grandparents had survived, frowned at the readout. Do we go dark again? He asked. Bury the leak, let them find nothing, and go back to work like we did the last 2 times. Idrissi considered the question for a long moment, remembering stories her own grandmother had told her about 11 days that had ended one world's illusions forever, and about the decades of silence that had followed. No, she finally said. I think it's time somebody found out the truth. 61 years is long enough to wait for the right moment. This might be it. She reached for a comm panel and routed a priority message up the chain, all the way to the surface, all the way to the Combined Defense Council itself. Signal command, she said. Tell them the Combine found the thread. Ask them how far they want us to let this one unravel. The answer came back within the hour, calm and unequivocal. Let them see everything. Fleet Admiral Tomas Reyes had been preparing for this exact message for most of his adult life, the way his father had prepared for it before him, and his grandfather before that. They're finally close enough to look, he said, standing before the Combined Defense Council in a chamber built into the same mountain range where the project had first begun 61 years ago. It's time to stop managing the secret and start managing the reveal. General Elena Voss, granddaughter of one of the original survivors, nodded slowly. We always knew this day would come eventually. The only question was whether we'd be ready for it. Are we? Asked a younger council member. Voss looked around the chamber at faces that represented 3 generations of patient, deliberate work. Engineers, soldiers, historians, all of them raised on the same founding principle passed down since the first night beneath that mountain. We've had 61 years to get ready, she said. I think we'll manage. The ashen verdict dropped out of warp at the edge of the Sol system 3 days later, sensors sweeping automatically for the source of the anomalous signal. What its instruments found instead made Fleet Commodore Yaris Dunn rise slowly from his command chair. "Report," he said. "Commodore, we're reading." Seton's voice faltered, staring at his console as though it might correct itself. "We're reading industrial output, massive industrial output, orbital shipyards, population centers, power signatures consistent with a fully developed spacefaring civilization, and not a small one either." "That's not possible," Yaris said. "This world was declared extinct 61 years ago. I read the report myself before we left the staging post." "Sir, I'm reading it directly. Sol 3 is inhabited, heavily inhabited, and there are—" Seton swallowed. "There are ships, Commodore, a great many ships positioned in a pattern that isn't random, it's a formation." The view screen resolved the picture a moment later, and every officer on the bridge of the ashen verdict went silent at once. Where 6 decades of Combine records had insisted upon a dead, ash-choked ruin, there now floated a civilization in full, thriving motion, orbital stations gleaming with lights, cargo haulers moving between a dozen visible shipyards, agricultural domes catching sunlight along the Terminator line, and behind them all, arranged in the dark at the edge of detection range, a fleet larger than anything the Vaskar Combine had ever fielded in a single engagement. "That's impossible," Yaris whispered. 61 years, 61 years of silence, and this was here the entire time." It had not merely been here. It had been growing, deliberately and patiently, every single year of that silence, generation stacked upon generation, each one inheriting not just the technology of the last, but the discipline required to keep it hidden. "Signal them," Yaris said, voice tight. "Demand explanation for this deception." His sensor officer, a younger Vaskar named Doral, spoke up nervously from her station. "Commodore, before we do, I'm reading weapon signatures on those distant ships. Consistent with directed energy platforms, but the harmonic profile doesn't match anything in our threat database. Nothing close." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning I can't tell you what those weapons do," Doral said. "Only that whatever it is, it's not something we've ever cataloged before." Doral's readouts shifted again, and this time her voice carried a different kind of unease. "Commodore, I need to report something else. I ran a passive scan comparison against our arrival telemetry from 3 minutes ago. The fleet formation at the edge of detection range has changed position." "Changed how?" Yaris asked. "They've repositioned to fully encircle us," Doral said. "Not aggressively. No weapons charged that I can detect. But we are, as of this moment, sitting inside a formation that could close on our position from every vector simultaneously within seconds, and we didn't register a single one of those ships moving into place." Seton's voice was quiet. "That means their engines, their thrust signatures, everything about how they move, is as invisible to us as their hull plating." "That's not possible," Yaris said again, the phrase beginning to feel less like disbelief and more like the only sentence his mind could still produce. "Commodore," Doral said, "with respect, I think we need to accept that a great many things we assumed were not possible simply were, and we only failed to notice because no one has ever had a reason to test the assumption against a species this patient before." Yaris said nothing for a long moment, watching the silent, waiting formation on his view screen, feeling for the first time in his career the particular vertigo of commanding a warship that had already lost an engagement it never had the chance to fight. The channel opened before Yaris's own message could even finish transmitting. A man appeared on the screen, weathered face, steady eyes, no fear in his expression at all. "Vaskar Cruiser Ashen Verdict," the man said. "You are inside a restricted system. I'm going to ask you once to reverse course." Yaris stared at the human, fury and disbelief warring across his features. You are supposed to be extinct." The man's expression did not change. "We know," he said, "that was rather the point." To understand what Fleet Commodore Yaris Dunn was truly looking at, one had to go back to the 11th day of the original Dominion invasion, 61 years earlier. By that day, Earth's scattered defense forces had been broken beyond any hope of conventional resistance. Cities burned. Orbital stations tumbled in fragments across low orbit. The Dominion, satisfied with its swift conquest, began withdrawing its main fleet toward richer targets, leaving behind a world it believed too shattered to ever threaten anyone again. What the Dominion did not account for was a small group of survivors. Engineers, soldiers, and civilians drawn from a dozen nations that had spent the war too divided to coordinate a real defense, who gathered in the ruins beneath a mountain range in what had once been called Switzerland, carrying with them the last salvaged fragments of humanity's most advanced prototype technology. Among them was a young engineer named Dr. Wen Marsh, barely 25 years old, who had lost her entire research team in the invasion's opening hours and carried with her nothing but a single data core and an idea that would define the next 61 years of human history. "They think we're finished," she told the survivors gathered around her in the dark, her voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. "They're leaving because they believe there's nothing left worth conquering. That belief is the only advantage we have left. If we ever let them see us rebuilding, they'll come back and finish what they started, and this time they won't leave a garrison behind them or a fleet distracted elsewhere." An older survivor, a retired general named Okonkwo Bassi, who had watched his entire command structure collapse in 11 days, studied her carefully across the flickering emergency lighting. "You're suggesting we disappear," he said, "completely, for as long as it takes, possibly longer than any of us will live to see finished." "I'm suggesting we let them believe we already age." "Ave," Marsh said. "There's a difference. We don't hide because we're weak. We hide because visibility this time would be the only thing that could actually kill us for good." A third voice spoke up from the back of the shelter, a young mother named Priya Nandakumar, holding an infant daughter who would grow up never remembering the war at all, who would instead grow up entirely inside the plan Marsh was proposing that night. "And what do we tell the children?" Priya asked. "What do we tell them when they ask why we live underground, why we can't send a message to anyone, why the sky above us has to stay quiet forever?" Marsh looked at the infant, then back at the gathered survivors. "We tell them the truth," she said, "that their silence isn't a cage, it's a foundation, and that someday when it's finally safe, they'll get to watch everything they built stop hiding." The survivors voted that night, in the dark beneath a mountain, to begin a project that would not be complete in their lifetimes, nor fully in their children's, nor even entirely in their grandchildren's. A project built entirely on the discipline of letting an empire believe a lie for exactly as long as the lie remained useful. To understand why that vote passed unanimously, one had to understand what those 11 days had actually cost. On the third day of the invasion, a joint defense fleet of 40 ships, the largest coordinated force Earth's fractured nations had ever managed to assemble on short notice, met the Dominion's advance formation above the debris field that would later be mistaken by Combine sensors for natural wreckage. It was not a battle, it was closer to an execution. Admiral Okonkwo Bassi, then still an active field commander rather than a survivor huddled in a mountain shelter, watched from the bridge of his flagship as Dominion beam weapons cut through shields his engineers had assured him were the strongest humanity had ever built. "Formation is holding," his tactical officer said, voice already fraying at the edges. "We're taking losses, but the line is holding." It held for 6 more minutes. Then it did not hold at all. Bassi would spend the rest of his life remembering the exact sound the bridge made when the Dominion's second wave arrived. Not an alarm, not a voice, but a silence, as 31 of his 40 ships vanished from the tactical display within 90 seconds. "Sound the retreat," he said, and hated himself for saying it, and knew even as he said it that there would be nowhere far enough to retreat to. He survived that day. Most of his fleet did not. He carried the weight of that ratio into the mountain shelter 8 days later, and he carried it in some form for the rest of his long life afterward. "We fought exactly the way they expected us to fight," he told the survivors gathered around Dr. Marsh that first night. "Loud, divided, announcing our positions before we'd even confirmed the enemy's numbers. We gave them every advantage they needed simply by being visible." "Then we stopped being visible," Marsh said. "Not because we're afraid of another fight. Because the next fight, whenever it comes, will be one we choose, not one we stumble into." Bassi studied her for a long moment in the dim emergency lighting, an old soldier measuring a young engineer's resolve. "It will take decades," he finally said. "Then we'd better start tonight," Marsh replied. For 61 years, every trace of human activity was buried beneath ice, rock, or the bottom of oceans the Dominion's departing forces had never bothered to survey closely. Every shipyard was constructed inside hollowed moons and asteroid fields far beyond any world the Dominion had catalogued as inhabited. Every communication between settlements traveled through tight-beam and buried cable networks instead of broadcast signals that might be intercepted by a passing scout. Every child born into the project was raised understanding, before they understood almost anything else, that the sky was something to be studied and never announced to. The first decade was the hardest. Survivors who remembered the invasion firsthand worked themselves into exhaustion rebuilding basic infrastructure from salvaged fragments, burying reactors beneath collapsed cities, teaching a shrinking population of engineers to train the next generation before the knowledge died with them. Food was scarce. Medicine was scarcer. More than one winter nearly ended the project before it properly began. The second decade brought stability, and with it, the first true shipyards hollowed into the bones of asteroids in the outer system, built by hands that had grown up hearing about the invasion only in stories, never in memory. The third decade brought the technological leaps that changed everything. Cloaking fields refined from Marsh's original data core fragments into something the Dominion itself had never developed in 3,000 years of unchallenged conquest, weapons S. Customs built around principles. The Dominion's own captured hardware had unknowingly taught human scientists to surpass. By the fourth decade, humanity was no longer merely surviving in secret. It was quietly becoming something the galaxy had no accurate record of at all. The fifth decade brought a challenge none of the original survivors had fully anticipated. Not scarcity and not discovery, but the slow erosion of purpose among a generation that had never known anything except the project itself. Talia Bassi's grandfather, an engineer named Femi Bassi, who had been among the first children born entirely inside the hidden settlements, remembered standing before a graduating class of young shipwrights at the height of that difficult decade, and being asked a question none of his own teachers had ever needed to answer. "Why do we keep building fleets no one will ever see us use?" one graduate had asked him. "What if we've spent our whole lives preparing for a moment that never comes?" Femi had thought carefully before answering, aware that his answer would shape how an entire graduating class understood their own purpose. "Then we will have spent our lives making certain our children never had to fight the kind of war that put us underground in the first place," he said. "That isn't a wasted purpose. That's the only purpose that ever mattered." Not every settlement handled that fifth decade with equal grace. Two of the smaller outposts, isolated for years at a stretch by the deliberate limits placed on interconnected broadcast networks, experienced periods of dangerous discouragement that the wider project's historians would later describe carefully, and without exaggeration, as the closest the entire endeavor ever came to quietly falling apart from the inside, rather than being discovered from without. It was General Elena Voss's own mother, then a mid-level coordinator working between settlements, who proposed the solution that ultimately held the project together through its hardest years. A rotating exchange of engineers, historians, and ordinary families between outposts, ensuring that no single community ever spent too many consecutive years without contact, without renewed purpose, without a reminder that their isolated effort was part of something far larger than any one settlement could see on its own. By the sixth decade, the fifth decade's quiet crisis had become, in the project's internal histories, less a wound than a lesson, that hiding a civilization from an empire was only half the difficulty. Hiding it from despair, generation after generation, without ever being able to point to a finished result, required its own kind of engineering entirely. "Commodore Dunn doesn't know it yet," said General Elena Voss, addressing the modern Combined Defense Council in the days after the Ashen Verdict's detection. But he just found the single best-kept secret in galactic history. Behind her, a hologram rotated slowly. A fleet numbering in the thousands, technology 2 generations beyond anything currently fielded by any known galactic power. All of it built inside a system, every star chart in known space still listed as a lifeless grave. "We let an empire believe a lie for 61 years, Voss said. Not because we were afraid to be seen, because being seen too early would have ended everything before it began. Now that a scout ship has stumbled onto the truth, we have a choice to make about how the rest of the galaxy learns it." A young council member, born decades after the invasion that had started it all, raised a hand nervously. "Ma'am, if the Combine reports what they found, the Dominion will hear about it eventually. Shouldn't we destroy that cruiser before it can transmit anything home?" Voss's expression did not change. "We could. It would be simple. It would also make us exactly the kind of empire we spent 61 years refusing to become." She turned back to the display. "Let the truth travel," she said. "On our terms this time, not the Dominion's and not the Combine's either." Phase 1 complete. Fleet Commodore Yaris Dunn stared at the man on his view screen, still struggling to reconcile 61 years of Combine records with the fleet now visible at the edge of his sensors. "You have been rebuilding," he said slowly, "for 6 decades, in complete silence, while the entire galaxy believed you were dead." "Yes," the man replied. His name, transmitted along with the channel, identified him simply as Fleet Admiral Tomas Reyes, grandson of one of the soldiers who had survived the original invasion. "We had good reason to let that belief stand for as long as we did." "The Dominion will hear of this," Yaris said. "You cannot hide a fleet of this size forever, not now that we've found you." "We're aware," Reyes said calmly. "That's precisely why you're going to leave this system today with an accurate account of exactly what you saw, instead of a version we had to force out of you by other me." "NS." Yaris's hand drifted toward his weapons console, an old instinct dying hard even in the face of everything his sensors were telling him. "You would let us leave, knowing what we now know, knowing we could report your exact position, your fleet's exact strength, to anyone willing to pay for the information." "We'd prefer it," Reyes said. "We've spent 61 years being patient. We don't intend to spend the next 61 being reckless, and destroying a cruiser that came here on legitimate orders would be exactly that kind of recklessness." Behind Reyes, on Earth's unified broadcast network, more than 14 billion humans, a population regrown from a handful of survivors who had once hidden in the dark beneath a mountain, watched the exchange in silence, many of them witnessing for the first time in their lives a moment their entire civilization had been built toward across 3 full generations. In a small settlement built into the side of a valley that had once been a war-torn ruin, an elderly woman named Priya Nandakumar, The same young mother who had once asked what to tell the children, now well into her 80s, watched the broadcast with her granddaughter beside her. "This is it, isn't it?" her granddaughter asked. "The day we stop hiding." "This is the day we choose to stop hiding," Priya said. "There's a difference. We're not being discovered. We're finally allowing ourselves to be seen." On the bridge of the Ashen verdict, Yaris asked the question that mattered most. "What do you want from us?" "Tell your archivist she was wrong," Reyes said. "Tell the Combine the truth. Tell anyone who will listen that the grave they catalogued 61 years ago grew into something else entirely, and that it did so without ever needing to announce itself first. And if the Combine decides to attack, now that they know the truth." Reyes's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Then Phase 2 begins," he said. "And I promise you, Commodore, it will not go the way it went 61 years ago." Yaris studied the man on his screen for a long moment, searching for the bluff he was certain had to be hiding somewhere in that calm, unshaken voice, and finding none. "You could have hidden for another 61 years, Yaris said finally. "Why let one supply convoy's stray signal end all of it now, on a day you didn't choose?" "We didn't choose the day," Reyes admitted. "But we chose, decades ago, what we'd do when a day like this eventually arrived, because we always knew it would. A secret of this size doesn't stay a secret forever. We spent 61 years making certain that, when it finally ended, it would end on terms we could live with, rather than terms forced on us by an enemy fleet instead of a single curious cruiser. And if it had been a Dominion warship, instead of ours that found you first." Reyes's expression did not change, but something in his voice carried the weight of a contingency planned for decades in advance. "Then, Commodore, you would be having a very different conversation with a very different admiral, and I suspect it would not have ended with anyone retreating quietly." Yaris absorbed that in silence, understanding fully, for the first time, exactly how much restraint had been extended to his ship and his crew in the preceding hour. "One more question," Yaris said. "Do you regret any of it? 61 years, 3 generations, entire lifetimes spent hiding underground for a war that might never have come." Reyes considered the question with more care than any of the previous ones. "I regret that it was necessary at all. I don't regret how we answered that necessity. Ask me again in another 61 years and perhaps I'll have a different answer. For now, that's the truth as I understand it." Phase 2 complete. Yaris Dunn had commanded warships for 30 years. He had never once needed to consider retreat as his opening strategic option, and the necessity of it now sat uneasily in his chest like a stone. "Bring up full defensive shields," he ordered, voice unsteady. "Prepare for immediate withdrawal." "Commodore," Seton said, staring at the tactical display, "the human fleet hasn't moved. They're not pursuing. They're not even fully powering their weapon systems. If anything, they've gone quieter since the transmission ended." "They don't need to power up," Yaris said quietly, finally understanding what every officer on that bridge was only beginning to grasp. "They've already won whatever this was, the moment we saw them at all. A demonstration of force would almost be beneath them at this point." He looked one last time at the view screen, at the shipyards, the orbital cities, the fleet arranged patiently in the dark, all of it built across 61 years by a species the galaxy had buried without ever confirming the grave was real. Doral, still monitoring sensors from her station, spoke up quietly. "Commodore, I'm picking up something else. Smaller Signat. Yours moving among the larger fleet formation. Training exercises from the pattern of it. They're not just maintaining a defensive posture. They're actively still building, still preparing, even as we watch." 61 years and they never stopped," Yaris murmured. "Orders, Commodore." "Set course back to the staging post," he said. "Full retreat. And somebody wake Archivist Salren the moment we're back in range. She's going to want to correct an entry personally, and I suspect she won't sleep again until she has." The Ashen verdict reversed course, and left the Sol system exactly as it had entered, quietly, without a single shot fired, carrying home a truth far more dangerous to the old galactic order than any weapon the ship itself possessed. Not every officer aboard the retreating cruiser processed the encounter the same way. A young ensign named Petra Callow, barely out of Combine officer training, found herself staring out the observation deck's viewport long after Sol 3 had shrunk to a single point of light behind them. "You're quiet," Seton said, finding her there during a routine deck check. "I keep thinking about the numbers," Petra said. 61 years, 3 generations, an entire civilization that decided together to disappear on purpose and rebuild in silence rather than beg for mercy or die fighting a war they couldn't win. "What about it troubles you?" "It doesn't trouble me," Petra said. "It humbles me. I don't know if the Combine could do what they did. I don't know if we'd have the discipline." Seton considered that for a long moment, watching the same point of light Petra had been studying. "Let's hope we never have to find out," he finally said. Petra requested reassignment within the year, transferring out of frontline fleet service and into the Combine's diplomatic corps, a decision that surprised nearly everyone who had served alongside her aboard the Ashen Verdict. "You could have had a real career in the fleet," Seton told her the day her transfer papers were finalized. "Command track eventually. Why give that up over one strange encounter?" "Because I watched an empire retreat without firing a shot from a species that had every reason to destroy us and chose not to," Petra said. "I want to understand how a civilization builds that kind of discipline. I don't think I'll learn it staring down a weapons console." Years later, Petra Callow would become one of the first Combine diplomats formally received on the surface of Earth itself, standing in a sunlit courtyard built on ground that had once been rubble, shaking hands with descendants of survivors, whose names she had only ever read in classified debriefing reports. Phase 3 complete. Archivist Meth Salrin stood before her console aboard the Deep Record, staring at the report Fleet Commodore Yeres Dunn had transmitted upon his return. 30 years of cataloging extinctions, and she had never once had to uncatalog one. "Update the entry," she told her junior researcher, voice quieter than she intended. "Species, human, status." She paused, searching for a designation that had never existed in 600 prior entries. "Status underestimated," she finally said, "for 61 years." Her researcher looked up from the console. "Ma'am, what do we tell the Combine leadership? What do we tell the Dominion if they ask us directly?" Salrin considered the question for a long moment, thinking of the calm, steady voice that had spoken to Commodore Dunn from a system every record in her archive had insisted was empty. "We tell them the truth," she said, "that the galaxy spent 61 years mourning a species that was never gone, that we should have looked closer sooner, before an offhand supply convoy report forced our hand, and that somewhere out past the edge of Combine space, an entire civilization just proved that silence can be a weapon sharper than any fleet we've ever built." She sat with that thought for a moment, then reached for her console and began the slow, careful work of amending an archive she had trusted completely for 30 years. "Pull the other 599 entries," she said quietly. "I want them all reviewed again. If we were wrong about this one, I need to know we weren't wrong about any of the others." Her researcher hesitated. "That's decades of work, archivist." "Then we'd better start today," Salrin said. "A record that can be wrong once can be wrong twice. I intend to make certain it isn't." The review took the better part of 3 years, conducted by a small team Salrin personally selected, and trained to apply the same skepticism to 599 other entries that a single stray radio signal had forced her to apply to the 600th. Most of the entries held up under renewed scrutiny, worlds genuinely destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. their populations and infrastructure erased so completely that no plausible rebuilding could have gone undetected for decades. But two entries, both worlds conquered by empires other than the Dominion, returned troubling ambiguities. Incomplete surveys, decades-old assumptions never independently verified, populations estimated rather than confirmed. Sauron flagged both for follow-up investigation before her eventual retirement, unwilling to let either possibility go unexamined the way Sol 3 nearly had. We may never know if either of those worlds is truly gone or truly still out there rebuilding, she told her successor, on her final day at the archive console she had occupied for over 3 decades. But we'll know we asked the question properly this time, instead of assuming an old report was good enough simply because no one had challenged it in 60 years. Phase 4 complete. Earth did not celebrate the day the truth reached the wider galaxy. There were no parades, no declarations broadcast in triumph, no fireworks lighting the sky that had stayed so carefully dark and quiet for 61 years. Instead, Fleet Admiral Reyes stood before the Combined Defense Council and delivered a report that echoed, in its restraint, the same quiet discipline that had carried this project across 61 years and 3 generations. The Combine cruiser has withdrawn, he said. No weapons discharged, no casualties on either side. They now possess an accurate account of our true status, delivered on our terms rather than extracted by force or discovered through violence. And the Dominion? Asked a council member. They'll hear of this eventually, through the Combine or through other channels we can't control. Reyes nodded slowly. They will. And when they do, they'll learn that the world they marked extinct 61 years ago spent every one of those years becoming something they never accounted for in any of their projections. We didn't rebuild to seek revenge for what happened here 6 decades ago. We rebuilt so that whatever comes next, it will be a choice we make, not one forced upon us again the way it was the first time. A young council member born long after the invasion spoke quietly. Do you think they'll come back, now that they know the truth? Reyes looked toward the star map behind him, where a single blue-green world sat at the center of a fleet built entirely in silence. I think, he said, that for the first time in 61 years it doesn't matter whether they do. That's the entire point of everything we built. Not that we'd never be found. That when we finally were, it wouldn't matter anymore. An older council member, one of the last still living who had been born before the reveal, was even conceivable as a near-term possibility, spoke up from the far end of the chamber. There are those among the public who will ask why we don't use this fleet now, while the galaxy is still absorbing the shock of our survival. Strike at the Dominion directly. Settle an old debt while their guard is down. Reyes turned to face the older man directly. We could. We have the strength for it, more than enough. But a debt settled through conquest is just a new occupation wearing our flag instead of theirs. We didn't spend 61 years building patience just to abandon it in year 62 out of convenience. Then what do we do with a fleet this size, if not use it? We let it exist, Reyes said, openly for the first time, not as a weapon aimed at anyone specific but as proof that we survived on our own terms. If the Dominion or the Combine or anyone else ever mistakes that patience for weakness, they'll learn otherwise soon enough. But we will not be the ones who starts that lesson. The chamber fell quiet, the weight of the decision settling over council members who understood, more clearly than most, exactly how much restraint that answer required. Outside the council chamber, across a planet that had spent 6 decades hiding every light and every signal, something began to change in small, quiet ways. Cities that had kept their brightest illumination shielded from orbit for generations began, slowly, testing what it felt like to shine without concealment. Broadcast engineers who had spent entire careers managing tight beam relays and buried cable networks began drafting proposals for open communication arrays, the kind their grandparents had abandoned in the ruins beneath a mountain. None of it happened overnight. 61 years of discipline did not unlearn itself in an afternoon. But for the first time in 3 generations, it had become possible to imagine a version of the future that didn't require staying hidden. Word of Sol 3's survival spread slowly at first, carried by a single Combine cruiser's report, then faster through trade channels and diplomatic circles that had never expected a 6-decade-old extinction entry to require correction. On a border world at the edge of Combine space, a young historian preparing a routine lecture on the galaxy's catalogued extinctions found herself rewriting her entire presentation the night the correction came through. 600 entries, she murmured to a colleague, staring at the amended record on her console. 600, and only one of them turned out to be wrong. What does it say about a species that could disappear that completely and come back like this, fully formed with a fleet nobody saw coming? Her colleague had no answer, only a slow, uneasy shake of the head. On a mining world once conquered by the Dominion generations earlier, a laborer named Gesh Toril heard the story secondhand from a trader passing through the settlement's cramped market district, and found himself repeating it to his own children that night by lamplight. They let everyone believe they were gone, he told them, his youngest daughter watching with wide eyes. For 61 years they said nothing, built nothing anyone could see, and when they were finally found, they didn't come out swinging. They just showed what they'd become and let the ones who found them walk away with the truth. Why didn't they attack if they were strong enough? His son asked. Wouldn't that have punished the ones who conquered them? Gesh considered the question carefully, the way his own father had once taught him to consider difficult things. Maybe, he said, because punishing an old enemy wasn't the point. Maybe the point was just proving that they'd survived on their own terms, without needing anyone's permission or anyone's pity. On the ocean world of Calith, an underground resistance movement that had spent a century believing the Dominion's grip could never be broken heard the story through smuggled data cores passed hand to hand across settlements the Dominion had never fully pacified. Their leader, an elder named Vistara who had buried 3 generations of fighters beneath the tides, addressed her newest recruits with words that would later be recorded in the earliest histories of a slow, spreading unrest across a dozen conquered worlds. For 100 years we have told ourselves that once an empire marks you finished, you stay finished, she said. A world called Sol 3 spent 61 years quietly proving that belief was never true. They did not need help. They did not need saving. They needed only time and the discipline to use it well. A young recruit raised a nervous hand. What if we don't have 61 years? What if we don't have 3 generations to wait? Vistara's expression softened slightly. Then we take whatever time we do have, and we use it exactly as well as they used theirs. The lesson isn't the number of years, it's the patience behind them. On the industrial moon of Draxu Prime, Dominion garrison soldiers, conscripted from a species conquered 3 centuries earlier, found themselves discussing the story in hushed voices during late-night watch rotations, the same way soldiers everywhere discuss the rumors too dangerous to say loudly. A junior sergeant named Rel Thacker, whose grandmother had been taken as a child during his people's original conquest, turned the story over in his mind more than once. An entire world given up for dead, he said to a trusted friend, and it turns out they were just waiting the whole time. Waiting and building and never once giving the game away. Do you believe it? His friend asked. I believe the Combine wouldn't correct 60 years of archives over a rumor, Rel said. And I believe if it's true, it means being conquered doesn't have to be permanent. It just has to end eventually on someone's terms. Maybe next time on ours. On a forested world called Velithar, occupied by the Dominion for less than a generation, a young teacher found herself fielding an entirely unplanned question during a history lesson about catalogued extinct civilizations. Is it true? one of her students asked, barely old enough to remember a time before Dominion administrators oversaw the local schools. That a whole world hid from the Empire for 61 years, right under everyone's sensors. The teacher, aware of at least 2 Dominion-aligned informants among the parents of children in her classroom, chose her words with practiced care. "The Combine has confirmed it," she said. "Whether it changes anything for us here on this world is not something I can promise you, but it is true. A species the galaxy considered finished decided, quietly, that it wasn't finished at all. How did they do it for so long without getting caught?" "Patience," the teacher said, "and the willingness to let 3 generations pass without ever once seeing the result of their own work. Most people give up long before that. They didn't." A younger student in the back of the room, barely 7 years old, raised a small hand. "Could we do that? Could we hide and rebuild too?" The teacher looked at the child for a long moment, aware of exactly how dangerous an honest answer might be, and exactly how important one was. "I think," she said careful, that the first step is believing it's possible at all. Everything after that is simply time." On a frozen research outpost near the edge of Combine mapped space, a retired Dominion fleet engineer named Corvin Meth, no relation to the archivist who had first flagged the anomaly, spent an entire night rereading the leaked technical assessments of the human fleet's cloaking technology. Technology his own decades of service had never come close to matching. 61 years, he muttered to an old colleague over a secure channel, the two of them among the last living engineers who had worked on Dominion sensor arrays during the original Sol campaign. "We built our entire detection doctrine, assuming no civilization could stay invisible for more than a decade or two before resource scarcity or internal conflict forced them into the open. We never accounted for a species disciplined enough to prove that assumption wrong." "You think there are others?" his colleague asked. "Other worlds we assumed were finished, quietly rebuilding somewhere we've stopped looking?" Corvin considered the question for a long time before answering. "I think," he finally said, "that for the first time in 3,000 years, the Dominion has to consider the possibility that every dead world in our records might not actually be dead. That's not a comfortable thing for an empire our age to learn all at once." Word of Sol 3's survival eventually reached the Caldron Dominion itself. Carried across trade networks and diplomatic backchannels, the Combine had never intended to share with their old rivals, but rumors of this size rarely respected intended boundaries. In a records vault on the Dominion's ancient homeworld, a mid-ranking archivist named Cethra Dovell found herself staring at a file that had not been opened in decades. The original Sol campaign battle report, filed 61 years earlier by a commander long since retired, describing a swift and total victory over a fractured, defenseless world. "They want me to confirm whether the report was falsified," she told her supervisor, a heavy-set Caldron named Orth who had served in records administration for longer than Cethra had been alive. "High Command wants to know if our own commander lied about the outcome 61 years ago." Orth studied the file for a long moment. "He didn't lie. Read the casualty estimates again. The world he described dying that day genuinely did die. What grew back afterward was something else entirely, built in secret across 6 decades by whoever survived the ashes." "Then how do we file this?" Cethra asked. "As an intelligence failure, as a threat reassessment. The categories we have don't cover a world that came back from a declared extinction with a fleet advanced enough to make Combine sensors nervous." Orth was quiet for a long moment, staring at the old report's final line, a casualty estimate that had once seemed final and complete, and now read as nothing more than the end of a chapter rather than the end of a story. "File it as a warning," he finally said, "because that's what it actually is, not to us specifically, to anyone who's ever assumed a conquered world stays conquered simply because we stopped watching it." The report was refiled under a new classification that had never existed in Dominion records before that year, one that would eventually be applied, cautiously, to a handful of other worlds whose old defeat reports no one had bothered to verify in decades. Status unconfirmed. Recommend reassessment. It was, in its own quiet bureaucratic way, the closest thing to an apology the Dominion's archives had ever produced. The commander who had filed the original Sol campaign report 61 years earlier was, by the time the correction reached Dominion Command, an elderly retired officer living out his final years on a quiet agricultural world far from the capital, largely forgotten by an empire that rarely celebrated the officers who delivered its conquests, once those conquests grew old and unremarkable. A young journalist, working for one of the few Dominion news outlets willing to cover the story at all, eventually tracked him down for a single brief interview. "Do you regret how you filed that report?" the journalist asked him, declaring the entire species extinct when clearly it wasn't. The old commander considered the question for a long time. Seated on a porch overlooking fields he had spent his retirement quietly tending. "I reported what I saw," he finally said. "A shattered world, cities burning, no organized resistance left standing. I was not wrong about what I saw that day. I was only ever wrong about what would grow from the ashes afterward, and I don't think any commander in 3,000 years of this empire's history has ever been trained to imagine that possibility." "Does that trouble you?" "Every single day," the old commander admitted, "because it means somewhere in our archives there may be other silent CES we mistook for endings, and I am far too old now to go looking for them myself." 1 year after the Ashen verdict's discovery, Earth's Combined Defense Council released a single statement, broadcast quietly across every channel now willing to carry it, translated by diplomatic teams into languages spoken across worlds humanity had never directly contacted before. It read, "We did not build this fleet or this silence out of fear alone. 61 years ago, an empire believed it had ended us, and left without looking back, certain nothing worth conquering remained. We let that belief stand for exactly as long as it served us, and not a day longer than necessary. We did not rebuild to punish anyone for what happened here. We rebuilt because we decided in the dark beneath a mountain that the next chapter of our history would be written by us alone, on our own timeline, according to our own judgment. Let this be understood clearly by anyone still counting worlds as conquered forever. Silence is not the same as surrender. Sometimes it is simply the sound of something patient, growing exactly where no one thought to look, waiting for the moment it no longer needs to hide at all." The statement ended, and across 100 worlds that had once assumed humanity gone forever, it began to travel not as a threat, but as a quiet, unshakable proof that even the worst possible beginning did not have to determine the ending. In the council chamber where the statement had been drafted, General Elena Voss watched the broadcast confirmation scroll across her console, then turned to Fleet Admiral Reyes standing beside her. "Your grandfather would have wanted to see this day," she said quietly. "He used to say the same thing about every one of us," Reyes replied. "That none of this belonged to any single generation, that we were only ever caretakers of something bigger than our own lifetimes. And now the whole galaxy knows it exists." "Now the whole galaxy knows it survived," Reyes corrected gently. "What it becomes next is still ours to decide." Voss walked to the chamber's viewport, looking out over the mountain range that had sheltered the very first survivors 61 years earlier, now home to a memorial garden rather than a hidden shelter. "My grandmother used to say the hardest part wasn't the hiding," she said. "It was raising children who had to be told, again and again, that the silence wasn't punishment, that it was a gift they were building for people who hadn't been born yet. Do you think they understood that, growing up inside it?" "Some of them," Voss said. "Others resented it for years before they understood. I think that's the honest cost of a plan this long. Not everyone who lives through it gets to feel proud of it while they're still living through it. Reyes joined her at the viewport, watching the same mountains in silence for a moment. "And now," he asked, "now that it's over?" "Now," Voss said, "I think we finally get to find out what this species looks like when it isn't hiding from anything at all. I suspect it will take us a while to learn that too. 61 years teaches a civilization how to disappear. It doesn't automatically teach it how to simply exist openly without looking over its shoulder." "That sounds like the beginning of an entirely different project," Reyes said. "Maybe," Voss agreed, "but at least this one we get to build in the light." The star charts were corrected eventually. Entry 412 rewritten in careful, deliberate language by an archivist who had spent 30 years certain she would never need to undo one of her own findings. Meth Salrin spent the better part of a decade after that quietly reviewing every extinction entry in the Combine's archive, driven by a discomfort she never fully explained to her colleagues, though most of them understood it without needing to ask. She found no other errors. Sol 3 remained the only entry she had ever gotten wrong. It was, she would later admit in a private memoir circulated among fellow archivists, the single most important mistake of her career, precisely because of how carefully she had to relearn what a dead world was supposed to look like. Somewhere beyond the edge of old Combine surveys, a fleet built across 61 years of silence still waited, patient as it had always been, ready for whatever the galaxy decided to do with the truth it had finally been given. On Earth itself, the generations that followed grew up under an open sky for the first time in the project's long history, not because the discipline that had built their civilization was abandoned, but because it had finally, deliberately, been allowed to rest. Priya Nandakumar did not live to see the 10th anniversary of that first broadcast, but her granddaughter did, standing on a hillside that had once been rubble and was now green, watching a night sky no longer required to hide anything at all. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened," her own daughter asked her that night, "if the Dominion had come back sooner, before we were ready?" "Every single day when I was young," she said. "But fear isn't the opposite of patience, child. Sometimes it's the reason patience exists at all. Your great-grandmother taught me that in the dark before either of us knew if any of this would work." Humanity had not disappeared that day, 61 years earlier. It had simply understood, in 11 catastrophic days, that the loudest civilizations are so often the first ones buried, and had chosen, deliberately together, across 3 full generations, to become something the galaxy would never see coming twice. 20 years after the Ashen Verdict first broke orbit around a world it believed dead, a new generation of humans stood on the observation deck of a shipyard built openly, in full sunlight, on the surface of the same moon that had once hidden Rosa Idrissi's control room 4 kilometers beneath the ice. Among them was a young engineer named Talia Bassi, great-granddaughter of the general who had once watched 31 of his 40 ships vanish above a debris field in a single afternoon. She had grown up hearing that story not as a warning, but as a foundation, the reason the shipyard she now helped design could exist in the open at all. "They still teach the old discipline in the academies," a visiting historian asked her, watching engineers move freely across a construction platform that would have been unthinkable in her great-grandfather's lifetime. "Even now, when there's no need to hide anymore." "We don't teach it because we still need to hide," Talia said. "We teach it because the patience it took to build all of this is worth remembering, whether or not the circumstances that demanded it ever return." "Do you think they will return, I mean?" Talia considered the question, looking out at the fleet visible now to any passing ship, no longer buried, no longer silent, simply present. "I think if they do," she said, "we'll be ready in a way my great-grandfather's generation never had the luxury of being, And I think that's the real ending to the story he used to tell. Not that we hid successfully, that we never had to hide again after we chose to stop. Archivist Meth Salrin, long retired from active service but still consulted occasionally by younger researchers, spent her final working years compiling a single volume that circulated quietly through Combine academic circles, a history of the 600 worlds she had once catalogued as extinct, with a new final chapter appended to the one entry she had gotten wrong. She closed that chapter with a single line that history would eventually attach to her name more than to any other work of her long career. An empire's records are only ever as accurate as its willingness to look again, she wrote. We looked again, once, because a supply convoy reported a stray signal no one could explain. I have often wondered in the years since how many other graves in our archives are waiting for someone to ask the same simple question we almost didn't. Somewhere far beyond the edge of what any star chart had ever properly surveyed, the fleet that had once existed only in silence now stood in full view of anyone who cared to look, not as a threat, and not as an apology, but simply as proof that the worst chapter in a civilization's history did not have to be the last one it ever wrote. Visitors to Earth in the decades that followed often remarked on the same small detail, one that never made it into any official history, but was repeated often enough in casual conversation to become its own quiet tradition. In nearly every settlement built on ground that had once been shelter, someone had planted a single light, left burning openly through the night, visible from orbit, visible from anywhere at all. No one needed to explain what it meant anymore. Everyone who lived there already understood. It was the opposite of the silence that had built them. It was permission, finally, to be seen. Phase 6 complete. If this one hit different, that's the point. The galaxy doesn't fear the loudest empire. It fears the one that went quiet on purpose and used every year of that silence well. Subscribe for more HFY sagas. Apex Chronicle.